Let's talk about lab-grown meat. We have been talking for so long about the meat industry not being a good industry in terms of pollution, in terms of how animals are treated, the carbon footprint, etc. Lab-grown meat is built, for lack of a better term, from cell samples that grow into the same tissue that is in meat from actual animals. And we've been following this for a long time. Back in 2013, I told you about in vitro cow meat that was created in a lab. It was hugely expensive. And then about a year ago, I told you that the technology advanced enough to drop the price of this lab grown meat by about 99%. Still pretty expensive, reportedly doesn't taste quite right. But there are some new developments that are getting us closer to this being a viable thing. And scientists that are involved in this research are now optimistic that they can cut the cost even more and get the taste right within about 4 years by 2020, mostly by increasing efficiency and producing milk in bulk. This could mean everything from steaks and burgers and sausages without some of the guilt that's associated with it. Now, of course, it's way easier to replicate ground beef for a burger than an actual steak, but the technology is working on both. And a lot of the issue is that when we think about this, we have to think about, okay, well, which issues in the meat industry are solved by this type of technology, because that's really what it is, and which issues aren't. And we often focus on the vegetarian angle, right? Would vegetarians eat this meat? But maybe that's not the most important angle, Rachel.
I don't think it's necessarily the most important angle. Also, personally, I think if they're taking the tissue from the muscle, it technically is still at its source at the beginning an animal product. But at the same time, you are vastly cutting down on energy sources, greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and associated water use. So wouldn't that be important to think about that as well?
That for me is the bigger issue, Lewis. And when you get down to it, vegetarians are a relatively small part of the population. So as interesting as it is to me theoretically to think about, okay, it was never part of an animal, but it is developed from animal cells originally. So would a vegetarian eat it or not? Very interesting question. But for the most part, the real impact would be if meat eaters would say, oh, this is the sustainable path, I'm going to switch. That's really who could have the biggest impact.
Yeah, and you would assume that as time goes on and this becomes cheaper and easier to produce and manufacture, perhaps even the big factory farms will start thinking, this is really what we need to get into because it just makes way more sense. So I'm envisioning a world, Dave, in the distant future where we have a nice fillet that is better than anything you can get right now from a real cow, and it was made in a lab.
That was going to get to my next question, which is I have no problem with this. I have no problem with this ethically or morally. I think that the environmental and cost benefits are obviously huge, and as the technology improves, that will only become even more pronounced. Would you still have Wagyu? Would you still have gourmet meats or special meats? Right now, there's a pretty big range in terms of meat and beef quality. How does that change the dynamic of what we have, Rachel? I mean, can you say, okay, well, this is lab-grown Wagyu and this is lab-grown regular stuff? If you're building it up cell by cell, maybe it's not, the reason Wagyu is more expensive now is because of how it is produced. There are more production costs. If you're just engineering it cell by cell, why not make it all Wagyu or whatever it is people like?
I mean, definitely. I think that would be an interesting kind of angle to take with constructing this meat. But I think it's ultimately, obviously, going to go back to tastes of people. And once they're kind of more cognizant of how this is available, they're going to think about, okay, does this actually taste differently? Because I feel like ultimately a lot of people who are eating Wagyu are concerned with taste.
Yes, there's no doubt that that is the taste-concerned meat-eating crowd. We'll continue following it. Very, very interesting.